Negotiations on Ukraine will be restarted in the near future. This was stated by Secretary of State Rubio in an interview with Fox News, apparently referring to the planned visit of Witkoff and Kushner to Kiev and Moscow. But that's not all. What options are possible and what is preventing a peace agreement? Our special correspondent in the United States, Dmytro Anopchenko, has gathered all the facts and theories.
America's chief diplomat, who recently criticized the negotiation format on Ukraine, is announcing new steps to be expected, as he said, in the coming weeks.
You will see our efforts over the next few weeks. It will become clear whether we can restart negotiations between the two sides in order to end the war.
At the same time, Rubio essentially acknowledged the main problem that is causing everything to stall. He says that both Kyiv and Moscow are not just, as they say, holding the line. Both sides have fundamental positions that they still refuse to abandon. And it seems the issue is about territories.
We understand that both sides have rather strong red lines, and until we bring them at least a little closer together, the desired result will not be achieved. But we are ready to begin, and the President told the team, if you see an opportunity to be the force that moves the negotiations forward, do it.
It is precisely the issue of territories that is the stumbling block, because Ukraine is not even considering the possibility of concessions. The United States has stopped putting pressure on this issue. But Moscow still has not abandoned its position of, we will fight until you give up Donbass, according to Western national security experts. And they emphasize, Moscow was counting on greater support from the White House and more advances, but these hopes have not materialized and, it seems, will not materialize.
I think the Russians are definitely dissatisfied because they never got the deal on Ukraine on their own terms that they were counting on. And then the Trump administration got distracted by the war with Iran. Naturally, the United States paid less attention to Ukraine, so there simply hasn't been any real process going on.
What could now get this process moving again are the intentions of congressmen to vote for the Graham sanctions. For almost a year and a half, the White House stalled the adoption of the document, not so much to avoid provoking Moscow, but rather Beijing. But now, at least in the Senate, this process can no longer be stopped.
The Trump administration is demonstrating its willingness to impose major sanctions against Russia, such as those last fall against oil giants Rosneft and Lukoil. And at the same time, while there was a sanctions pause in the United States, the Europeans increased their support for Ukraine, and it has become much more significant. So now Russia finds itself in a situation where it cannot even theoretically win this war.
Interestingly, this is exactly what forced Trump to change his attitude, according to journalists who are now speaking with officials from his administration. They say the current American president does not like to read analytical reports. In high-level politics, he acts, as they say, on reflexes, that is, on emotions, and always subconsciously tries to side with the winner.
Trump's attitude toward politicians is taking a rather interesting turn. Now, Netanyahu is somewhat out of favor with him, while Zelensky, on the contrary, has risen in his eyes. Donald Trump likes winners and doesn't like losers. And it was through this stereotype that he perceived Zelensky last year, because Putin told him he would win, and Trump believed it. But the reality of the war in Ukraine turned out to be different. Ukraine was innovating and fighting back in such a way that it caught Trump's attention and made an impression.
That's why it's so important to hold the line at the front, to continue long-range strikes, I hear from experts, because Trump hasn't changed the principle by which he evaluates allies. He simply follows the rule, I'm with the one who is winning. And loyalty that is tied only to the image of a winner is always unstable. It exists only as long as the front holds, or until the priorities or even the mood of the Oval Office occupant change. That's why Washington is advising to speed up as much as possible the process of obtaining licenses to produce PAC-3 missiles for the Patriots.
This is probably Zelensky's main goal right now, to secure that agreement, to obtain the blueprints for building his own missile defense system using American technologies, but manufacturing them independently. Because it's one thing to have it promised to him and quite another when the process is finalized. After all, what Ukraine needs most today is one thing, to protect its cities from Russian missiles.
That's why the question is, if not yet a ceasefire, then scenarios for mutual suspension of airstrikes will definitely become a topic at the upcoming meetings with Witkoff and Kushner, according to forecasts in Washington. Because Putin will clearly try to use this winter to exert the greatest pressure on Ukraine since the war began. And the remaining end of summer and autumn should, in theory, be enough time to try to speed up negotiations, perhaps even to arrange a three-way conversation and thus avoid such a scenario.
That is why Zelensky is now so actively offering Ukrainian drone technologies to help the Americans in the Gulf. That is why he is bringing evidence that the Russians helped the Iranians. He is trying to use this time to prove to Trump as much as possible, Ukraine is your friend. There is no need to put pressure as you did before. Just support us, because we are ready to support you as well.
As for the visit of Trump's negotiators, diplomatic sources do indeed mention the time frame. They are expected within the next few weeks. However, not only are the exact dates not being disclosed, they have not yet been determined. From Washington, Dmytro Anopchenko, Serhiy Koval, American Bureau of Inter-TV Channel. The United News Marathon.
We will discuss diplomatic moves and other political news with an expert. Today in our studio is Bohdan Popov, an expert from the Analytical Center United Ukraine. Mr. Bohdan, welcome. It's good to see you.
Thank you. The pleasure is mutual.
Mr. Bohdan, this week we heard many statements, including from Secretary of State Rubio, that diplomacy is very important and that in the near future the United States will try to resume the negotiation process between Ukraine and Russia. In your opinion, is there any real basis for this resumption?
Well, there has always been a basis for it. Let me put it this way. There are Ukrainian peace initiatives that were launched several years ago, when in fact Ukraine has always declared its readiness for peace, for a fair and just peace. Well, unlike Putin, who also claims that he is ready for peace, okay, but only if he is given half of Ukraine, well, that's hardly reasonable or fair. There is Trump, who is under pressure from the upcoming elections, which are very soon, and he has two critically important issues that he needs to resolve somehow before these elections. These are Ukraine and Iran. And there has been no progress on either issue. Let's be honest, Trump hasn't managed to handle either one. That is, he hasn't won the war in Iran. He hasn't made peace in Iran either. He took political responsibility for the Ukrainian issue even before his inauguration, let me remind you, almost 2 years ago now, and still, well, there is no clear progress visible to the American voter. In other words, the war hasn't been stopped under any conditions. And that's why Trump previously tried to put pressure on Ukraine, because supposedly for him, a quick end to the war would have been better, the best scenario, so he could show his voters that peace had come. As he likes to say, 28, 35 wars, including the war on Mars with the homunculi, he's already ended all of them. No, it turns out that with Ukraine it's harder, so he's trying to do at least something, and for him now there is a duality in strategy. On the one hand, he can try to end the war, either by putting pressure on Ukraine or by putting pressure on Russia. He realizes that he lacks the leverage to quickly force either side to make peace. And now he has chosen a different strategy, to demonstrate a diplomatic process as if, with his assistance, the sides are sitting down and negotiating. And now it depends on how these two other sides will play, because the initiative is coming from Trump. Now it depends on whether we and the Russians will sit down at the negotiating table. We, of course, are ready, and we have clearly communicated our proposals, including at the recent meeting between President Zelensky and President Trump, which, according to statements from both sides, was quite productive. But the question is about Putin. In other words, Putin is not in a situation where he would accept the Ukrainian proposal. There is no indicator, for example, that the Russian Federation's economy is kaput. So yes, there are reversal trends, things are bad, there's a recession, there's serious inflation, they're holding out as best they can, they're burning through, well, their last reserves. But these last reserves in the Russian Federation will still last for several more years under the current sanctions. So the situation isn't so dire that they would stop. As for manpower, well, let's just leave that aside, as they say, because there's plenty of it. And here, well, Putin's willingness is the main thing. Will Putin play along for Trump's benefit and demonstrate some kind of diplomatic process in order to boost Trump's ratings? Or will Putin, on the contrary, decide to undermine Trump, to trip him up? In other words, to make sure Trump loses the election and, accordingly, sabotage the negotiations. So he could either sabotage them right now, simply by, well, just not showing up to them, basically. Or he could go to the negotiations, but then completely sabotage them before the elections, discredit all of Trump's efforts, and thus drag down his ratings. Here, unfortunately, a lot depends on our enemy.
Pressure on Putin. What levers does Trump have to actually push through? And the first option is to make him at least sit down at the negotiating table.
Well, the lever that's currently going through Congress as a whole, which has been discussed for many years already. The Graham-Blumenthal bill in some 1,000th revision already, which gives Trump the ability, in its first version, it allowed him to impose 500% tariffs against buyers of Russian oil. Now it's 100%. And I would like to remind you that they do not get activated automatically after Trump signs it. This gives Trump the ability to impose them at any time he wishes by executive order, that is, to issue a decree introducing these tariffs. And in fact, this lever is necessary for Trump, and it's very useful, not only for putting pressure on Putin, but also on China and India at the same time. In other words, Trump gets himself a loaded bazooka, which he will have and can fire at any moment. For him, this is a very good lever. The issue is that this is moving through American bureaucracy rather slowly. The first steps have been taken, and that's already very good because we remember how long this bill just sat there. Senators would sign it, but it wasn't going anywhere. Now, the first vote has been held. It hasn't been voted on in the Senate yet, but, well, de facto it has been put on the Senate's agenda, let's put it that way, and we hope it will be voted on in the near future. Then, of course, it goes to the House of Representatives and the President's signature. And this is a good lever of pressure. Well, let me remind you that Trump can impose other separate sanctions, for example, like the ones he imposed against Russian oil, against Lukoil, Rosneft, and so on. Yes, due to the war in Iran, there were certain reverse trends, but now these sanctions are in effect and they impact both the energy market and the Russian Federation as a whole. And of course, the levers of diplomatic pressure through Beijing have not been cancelled either. Trump has a pressure button on the People's Republic of China, which is in fact the main wallet of the Russian war, buying Russian oil and trading with the Russian Federation. It is Russia's largest trading partner. And that's why Trump actually has quite a lot of levers at his disposal. The question is whether he is ready to use them to their full extent. Trump, after all, has this unhealthy idea of befriending the Russian Federation against China. Well, in general, this isn't just a Trump idea. Let me remind you of previous American administrations, including Obama and others, who tried to do the same. How many times have the States saved Russia from starvation and complete collapse, even after the fall of the Soviet Union? Well, at least 3 times. So this is a kind of trend that for some reason has developed in the States, and they see Russia as an ally against the PRC. Well, to me, it's strange, but certain factors prompt even the current president of the United States to adhere to this, which is why he doesn't always push hard enough on the Russian issue, unfortunately.
Regarding the air truce, there was information that President Zelensky and President Trump might discuss this issue. So, in fact, with sanctions or the possibility of imposing sanctions against Russia, can Trump put pressure on Putin to at least establish such an air truce?
Well, on the one hand, he needs to obtain this leverage. That's the first thing, and it's very important. Second, is he ready to put pressure on Putin? In recent months, we have seen a positive trend in relations with the United States. We haven't seen this in a long time. That is, at the NATO summit, Trump makes positive statements about us, and there is an effective meeting between President Zelensky and Trump. Accordingly, a series of events is taking place that gives us hope that Trump has indeed changed his position. Because first of all, he sees that supporting Ukraine is electorally popular. In reality, Americans support Ukraine. The majority of the US population does. This is reliable information. This is confirmed by both Republican and Democratic pollsters. So it's not just someone spreading rumors. This is objective reality. Secondly, there is bipartisan support in Congress, which is also very important. And by the way, our team has done a tremendous amount of work, really at all levels. It's very good right now that Ambassador Stefanishina is remaining as the ambassador to the United States of America. We can see how she works. And those rumors that were being spread about a possible replacement came from some insider sources, but they have not been confirmed. In my opinion, this is very positive, because in just 1 year, she has managed to accomplish a phenomenal amount of work. There has never been such a number of meetings with senators or with Congress, nor has there ever been so many decisions from the American administration during such a critically important period for Ukraine. Here we have the URL program, the shift in Trump's position, and all these trends, even the sanctions against Rosneft and Lukoil, these are truly achievements of the Ukrainian side. Because even when it comes to sanctions, there are teams working in the president's office who provide Americans and Europeans with information on what to include in the sanctions packages, how the Russians are circumventing them, and so on. And this is happening in every area. Everything is transmitted through the embassy. Accordingly, the ambassador communicates with representatives of the American authorities on site, and then certain decisions are made in our favor. So it's good that this work will continue. I believe in this team because I also have some personal communication with members of this team. I know quite a lot of information about their work, and honestly, they are showing really impressive results. And we hope that our team will be able to push things through. But unfortunately, well, it's not just up to us alone. After all, it's Trump and the Trump administration who sign off on things, and their position remains complicated. This is the most difficult administration that Ukraine has ever had to work with.
Could the possible visit of Witkoff and Kushner to Kiev at the end of August change anything?
Well, look, a visit to Kiev is already a good thing because they haven't been here yet. Of course, Witkoff and Kushner are not the best communicators we would like to deal with, but they are the ones we have. It's the same story. Well, there's Trump. There are these figures we'll have to communicate and work with. And we hope that nevertheless we will manage to assert our position again. But we must not forget that Witkoff and Kushner are like a broken telephone. They don't make decisions themselves. If Trump's position remains positive toward us, we get results that are favorable to us. But we see that on some issues, Trump still doesn't push hard enough. Trump is still afraid to put too much pressure on Putin, as they say. It looks, well, very, funny and cynical, but on the other hand, we still have to accept reality and continue working on the directions we have from our side. Because, let's not indulge in fantasies. You can't turn Trump into a pink pony here. We're not going to turn him into a great ally overnight. This is systematic work that we will have to do ourselves. I doubt that this war will end soon. I don't see any willingness from Russia to end it. I don't see any willingness from our allies to radically force Putin to make peace, and so we'll be stuck in this mess for a very long time. And we need to gradually work in all the directions that have already been set.
Mr. Bodan, is a visit by Trump to Kyiv possible?
Well, not during the war. I very much doubt that he will actually change the game that much. Yes, he is emotional. Yes, he is impulsive. But for Trump to come to Kyiv, well, I don't believe it, because that would be a demonstration. It's like when Trump visits Israel, it's a demonstration that everything is rock solid with you. Well, with Ukraine, Trump is not that rock solid yet to come, at least not until this war is over. All the more so we can see what kind of geopolitical game is being played here, so, well, anything is possible. Russia could expand the theater of military operations. Russia is preparing for mobilization. There are already certain points of contact, let's say, with Iran, which are close to igniting a conflict, so to speak, between Ukraine and Iran, which would also complicate the situation. You understand, the escalation of the war from the Middle East to Central Europe, that would be a disaster. That would be World War III, and that means a nuclear exchange in the near future. Therefore, understanding all these trends, understanding that all these issues remain unresolved and open, Trump will not make any broad diplomatic gestures, at least until the war in Ukraine is over.
The Russian dictator Putin made a rather cynical statement saying something like, "What are we going to do without the special military operation? How are we going to live without it?" What does this statement of his mean? And is it a signal that we shouldn't expect any negotiations, any end or any compromises from the Russian side, at least in the near future?
Look, we're live on air, so there's no one to bleep anything out. So I'll just say it like this. Yes, Putin does not want to end the war. Putin wants to keep fighting. Putin wants to seize Ukraine. Putin wants to put pressure on Europe. Putin wants puppet states all over Europe to control the economy, to control security, and so on. Putin wants to drive out the so-called collective West from everywhere, as they say in the Russian press, just completely. He wants to defeat them all. For him, this is a kind of historical goal. He thinks he's the new, I don't know who, Stalin, Alexander I, Napoleon. Well, whoever he thinks he is, he still remains a bold swamp monster. He has this ambition and he will keep pushing in all these directions to achieve his goal until his hands are literally cut off, his economic hands and accordingly his physical resources for waging war. Well, there's a mechanism for this too. Let's be honest, all the Russian missiles that have been hitting Kyiv and other peaceful Ukrainian cities lately, what's inside them? Western components. Why? Because the sanctions aren't working fully, they're being circumvented. There's China, which is helping, and there are Central Asian countries that are helping too. In its 20th package of sanctions, the European Union introduced for the first time a mechanism against circumvention, and Kyrgyz jurisdiction was included, as a lot of goods used to bypass sanctions were going through there. But let's be honest, even if we put all the Central Asian countries on the EU and even US sanctions lists, 90% still goes through China. So cutting off 10%, well, that's just okay. What's Putin going to do without a finger? Is he not going to be able to sign decrees, as they say? So specifically regarding Russia, sanctions and the war, that is, if we don't close all the channels for bypassing sanctions, if we don't cut the Russian economy all at once, don't turn Russia into a technologically degraded Ukraine, and at the same time keep the Ukrainian economy afloat. Let me remind you that the Russians are now taking out absolutely everything. Logistics, business, warehouses and so on. They have seriously raised the stakes. Yes, so have we. But we have to understand that Russia is huge, and no matter how hard we try, they have more resources. We live on other people's money, and we really need this foreign money, foreign weapons, and so on. That's why our allies need to cut Russia down and keep us afloat. And only then can Putin be forced to do anything.
Mr. Bodan, thank you very much, as always, for an interesting conversation. We will be glad to see you in the studio again. Let me remind you that our guest in the studio was Bodan Popov, an expert from the Analytical Center, United Ukraine.